Long before the thunder of artillery shattered the tranquility of the Korean peninsula in 1950, Korea's story was one of unity and resilience, shaped by centuries of shared language, culture, and identity. For much of its history, Korea existed as a unified kingdom, known in various eras as Goryeo and later Joseon, with a distinct civilization nestled between its powerful neighbors, China and Japan. This sense of unity would be challenged, first by foreign domination and then by ideological division, setting the stage for one of the most consequential conflicts of the 20th century. The modern unraveling of Korea's unity began in the early 20th century, though the seeds of outside interference had been sown long before. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, subjecting the peninsula to a harsh colonial regime that lasted 35 years. During this period, Koreans endured the loss of political autonomy, economic exploitation, and a concerted campaign to erase their national identity. Japanese authorities imposed their language, restricted Korean education, and suppressed traditional customs. Korean resistance never entirely ceased. Clandestine independence movements persisted both within Korea and among expatriate communities, fueled by news of uprisings and the hope of eventual liberation. The Japanese colonial period was a time of profound hardship, but also of a resilient Korean spirit that would later shape the peninsula's response to new challenges. Life under Japanese rule brought sweeping changes to society and the economy. Japanese officials restructured land ownership, often to the detriment of Korean farmers, and controlled key industries, funneling resources to support Japan's imperial ambitions. As Japan intensified its militarization in the 1930s, Koreans were conscripted into forced labor, with many sent abroad to work in mines, factories, or even as soldiers. The occupation left scars that lingered long after the Japanese surrender in 1945. Koreans emerged from colonial rule with a deep sense of grievance and a fierce desire for genuine self-determination, but also with a society deeply fractured by decades of oppression and economic disparity. The end of World War II brought sudden, dramatic change. In August 1945, as Japan's empire collapsed, Korea found itself unexpectedly freed from colonial domination. Yet this liberation was not the result of a coordinated Korean effort, but rather a byproduct of the Allied victory over Japan. The fate of Korea was determined not in Seoul or Pyongyang, but in distant capitals, Washington and Moscow, where leaders had their own visions for the post-war order. In the waning days of the war, American officials, concerned about Soviet advances in Northeast Asia, proposed dividing the peninsula as a temporary measure. The 38th parallel was hastily chosen as the line of demarcation. North of this line, Japanese forces would surrender to Soviet troops, south of it, to the Americans. This division, enacted with little input from Koreans themselves, would prove fateful. At first, many saw it as a practical arrangement, an administrative convenience, not a permanent border. Yet the realities of occupation soon took hold. In the north, the Soviets moved quickly to establish control, working with local communists and returning exiles to set up a new administration. In the south, the United States oversaw its own military government, grappling with the twin challenges of societal chaos and the need to build new institutions from scratch. The immediate aftermath of liberation was marked by both hope and turmoil. Across the country, local committees for the preparation of Korean independence sprang up, eager to fill the vacuum left by departing Japanese officials. These committees, often led by seasoned activists from the independence movement, sought to assert Korean authority and shape the nation's future. However, their ambitions soon collided with the realities of occupation and the growing influence of external powers. The Soviet and American authorities each viewed the peninsula through the lens of their own strategic interests and soon began to nurture rival political groups aligned with their respective ideologies. As the months passed, the division at the 38th parallel deepened. In the north, Soviet support helped elevate Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla, to prominence. With Moscow's backing, Kim and his allies consolidated power, dismantling rival factions and laying the groundwork for a one-party state. Land reforms and nationalizations were implemented, reshaping the northern economy along socialist lines. In the south, American authorities faced a more complex political landscape, with a spectrum of parties and leaders vying for influence. Among them, Syngman Rhee, a seasoned nationalist with strong ties to the United States, emerged as a leading figure. Rhee's anti-communist credentials and assertive leadership appealed to American officials wary of leftist influence. By 1947, it was clear that the division of Korea was becoming more entrenched rather than less. Efforts to negotiate a unified government faltered as Cold War tensions hardened. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to ensure that their respective zones would reflect their political and economic models. As a result, attempts at reunification, including United Nations-sponsored elections, were stymied by mutual distrust and the refusal of both superpowers to relinquish their influence. The North and South each moved to establish separate states, culminating in a decisive year, 1948. In August 1948, the Republic of Korea, ROK, was proclaimed in the South, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. Just weeks later, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was established in the North, under Kim Il-sung's leadership. Each government claimed to represent the legitimate authority over the entire peninsula. The division, once presumed temporary, had become institutionalized. This split was not merely a political reality. It also began to shape the very identity of Koreans on either side of the 38th parallel. Families were separated, economic systems diverged, and the once shared social fabric began to fray. The withdrawal of Soviet and American occupation forces by 1949 did little to ease tensions. Both Koreas were left with governments that saw the other as illegitimate and a threat to their own survival. The border quickly became a zone of skirmishes and provocations. Evidence from the period suggests that both the North and South engaged in cross-border raids and sought to undermine each other's authority, further deepening the sense of mistrust. The ideological divide was stark. In the North, a tightly controlled state committed to communist principles. In the South, an anti-communist regime backed by the West, determined to root out leftist opposition. Overlaying these local dynamics was the broader context of the Cold War. The division of Korea was not an isolated event, but part of a global contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. Each viewed the peninsula as a strategic outpost in the struggle for influence in Asia. In Washington, policymakers saw the emergence of a communist Korea as a threat to the containment of Soviet expansion. In Moscow, the establishment of a pro-Western state in the South was viewed with equal suspicion. The Korean peninsula, once a pawn in the imperial ambitions of its neighbors, now found itself at the center of a global ideological confrontation. The legacy of Japanese colonialism continued to shape both societies. In the North, leaders drew on their credentials as resistance fighters and promised to eradicate the vestiges of colonial exploitation. In the South, the challenge was to build a modern state out of the ruins left by occupation, all while navigating the pressures of American oversight. The economic and social divisions inherited from the colonial era proved difficult to overcome. The scars of the past were evident in land disputes, industrial imbalances, and lingering resentment toward those seen as collaborators with the Japanese regime. By the late 1940s, the atmosphere on the peninsula was tense and volatile. Both the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea sought to unify Korea under their respective banners, and neither was willing to accept the status quo indefinitely. The border at the 38th parallel, once a line on a map, had become a flashpoint. Skirmishes along the frontier became more frequent, each incident reinforcing the sense that peaceful reunification was slipping further from reach. The superpowers, despite their rhetorical commitment to Korean independence, remained deeply involved, providing military and economic support, shaping policy, and, in effect, ensuring that the division would persist. The failure to achieve Korean reunification was not for lack of effort on the part of ordinary Koreans or even some political leaders. Various conferences and proposals for elections across the entire peninsula were advanced, but these were consistently undermined by the deepening mistrust between the superpowers and their local allies. Each side accused the other of subverting democracy and preparing for aggression. The resulting impasse left the Korean people caught between competing visions for their nation's future, with little agency over the ultimate outcome. As the calendar turned to 1950, the Korean peninsula stood on a knife's edge. The wounds of colonial rule had not healed, and the division imposed by foreign powers had hardened into bitter rivalry. Both governments, convinced of their own legitimacy and seeking to unify Korea on their terms, eyed each other with suspicion and hostility. The border bristled with troops, and the rhetoric of confrontation filled the airwaves. The superpowers, for their part, remained entangled in the affairs of their protégés, their interests in Korea colored by the broader imperatives of the Cold War. Thus, when conflict erupted in June 1950, it was not simply the product of a sudden breakdown, but the culmination of years of division, mistrust, and unresolved grievances. The Korean War would bring devastation on a scale few could have imagined, but its roots lay in the complex and often tragic history of a nation struggling to reclaim its unity in a world reshaped by empire and ideology. The story of Korea before 1950 is one of endurance and division, of hopes raised and dashed, and of a proud people caught in the cross-currents of history. In the gray dawn of June 25, 1950, the Korean peninsula erupted into open war. North Korean forces, heavily armed and organized, surged across the 38th parallel in a sudden and massive assault against the south. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Columns of Soviet-supplied tanks and artillery spearheaded the onslaught, catching the South Korean defenders unprepared. In those first desperate hours, the scale and coordination of the offensive left little doubt. This was no border skirmish, but a calculated invasion, one that would draw the world into a conflict of startling ferocity. Within days, North Korean troops pushed deep into the south. The Republic of Korea's ROK army, undertrained and under-equipped, reeled under the weight of the assault. Most units collapsed or retreated in disarray, unable to stem the tide. The invaders captured Seoul, the South's capital, in less than a week, dealing a massive blow to morale and the logistical backbone of the ROK government. Refugees flooded southward, clogging roads with carts, bicycles, and bundles of belongings. An exodus that would repeat itself in reverse more than once before the war's end. News of the invasion reverberated across the globe. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman's administration faced a dire test. The sudden attack was seen not just as a local struggle for the Korean peninsula, but as the opening salvo in a larger Cold War confrontation. The memory of recent communist victories in China, along with ongoing tensions in Europe, weighed heavily on American policymakers. There was real fear that Korea could be the first domino to fall in a cascade that might engulf all of Asia. The stakes, as Truman and his advisors saw them, extended well beyond Korea's borders. Almost immediately, the United Nations was thrust into the heart of the crisis. On June 25th and again on June 27th, the United Nations Security Council convened emergency sessions, acting with unusual speed and unity, thanks in part to the absence of the Soviet Union, which was boycotting the Council over disputes unrelated to Korea. The Security Council condemned the North's aggression and called on member states to assist South Korea. At Washington's urging, the United States and other countries began preparing to send military aid. For the first time in its brief history, the United Nations would serve as the banner for a multinational military response to open aggression. Truman's public statement, issued in the tense hours after the invasion, made clear the gravity of the moment. He described the attack as a threat to international peace and an affront to the principle of collective security. Under the banner of the United Nations, American air and naval forces were directed to support the South, and soon after, ground troops followed. The United States, having withdrawn its occupation forces from Korea in 1949, now reversed course, committing itself rapidly and decisively to the peninsula. This was not a step taken lightly. The shadow of World War II still loomed large, and public opinion in America was wary of another distant conflict. Yet the Cold War imperative to resist communist expansion outweighed all hesitation. The arrival of American forces, however, did not immediately halt the North Korean advance. The early weeks of fighting were marked by a relentless southern retreat. North Korean divisions, better equipped and experienced, pressed on, forcing South Korean and newly arrived American troops ever backward. By late summer, the defenders were pushed into a shrinking wedge of territory at the southeastern tip of the peninsula, a perimeter anchored on the port city of Pusan. Here, at the so-called Pusan perimeter, the situation grew desperate. Supplies and reinforcements had to be rushed in by sea, and the defenders withstood repeated assaults, artillery barrages, and infiltration attempts. The fate of South Korea hung in the balance. Despite the odds, the defenders at Pusan held. The perimeter became a crucible, a place where United Nations forces, now including troops from the United States, Britain, Australia, and other countries, learned to fight together under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. The lines bent but did not break. In the skies above, American air power began to make a difference, harassing North Korean supply lines and slowing the enemy's momentum. On the ground, battered but determined, international forces dug in for what would prove to be one of the war's pivotal stands. While the world watched the drama at Pusan unfold, General MacArthur and his staff planned a bold counterstroke. The plan was audacious and risky. Rather than continue to bleed at the perimeter, MacArthur proposed to strike far behind enemy lines with an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city near Seoul. The operation, scheduled for mid-September, would require precise timing, coordination, and a degree of luck. Tidal flats, narrow channels, and formidable coastal defenses made Incheon a daunting target, but if successful, the landing could sever North Korean supply routes and encircle their forces in the south. On September 15, 1950, United Nations forces landed at Incheon in a dramatic amphibious assault. The invasion caught the North Koreans completely off guard. Within hours, United Nations troops seized the port, and soon after they advanced towards Seoul. The landing at Incheon proved to be a turning point. North Korean forces, now vulnerable in their exposed southern positions, tried to withdraw, but many were trapped or destroyed. The defenders at the Pusan perimeter broke out, linking up with the Incheon forces and rapidly retaking lost territory. In a matter of weeks, the momentum of the war reversed. Seoul was recaptured, and North Korean units retreated in confusion. The success at Incheon emboldened United Nations commanders and policymakers alike. With the enemy in full retreat, the decision was made to pursue the North Koreans across the 38th parallel. The goal now expanded from the defense of South Korea to the reunification of the peninsula under Southern rule. United Nations forces pushed north, capturing Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, in October 1950. For a brief, heady moment, it seemed as if the war might be won and the peninsula reunited. But the conflict was far from over. As United Nations troops neared the Yalu River, which marked Korea's border with China, a new and unforeseen force entered the fray. In late October, Chinese troops began crossing into North Korea in large numbers. For weeks, their presence was hinted at through captured prisoners and battlefield reports, but the scale of their intervention came as a shock. The Chinese, alarmed by the approach of hostile armies to their border and motivated by both security concerns and a desire to support a fellow communist regime, had resolved to act decisively. The first major Chinese offensive struck in late November 1950. Waves of Chinese soldiers, often moving by night and using the terrain to their advantage, fell upon United Nations positions. The suddenness and ferocity of the attack shattered the sense of impending victory. United Nations and South Korean troops, caught off guard by the scale of the Chinese intervention, were forced into a rapid and chaotic retreat. Bitter winter winds swept the peninsula as the armies clashed and maneuvered. The fighting grew desperate, with heavy casualties on both sides. In the mountains and valleys of North Korea, some of the most intense and costly fighting of the war unfolded. Among the most dramatic episodes was the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir, where American and Allied units, encircled by Chinese forces, fought their way out under brutal conditions. The retreat was harrowing, temperatures plunged far below freezing, and soldiers endured not only enemy fire but frostbite and exhaustion. Despite the adversity, the retreating columns managed to break through Chinese lines and evacuate to the coast, an episode that would become emblematic of the war's hardship and horror. With the Chinese now fully committed, the conflict entered a new and volatile phase. The United Nations front was pushed back below the 38th parallel, and by January 1951, Seoul once again changed hands, falling to communist forces for the second time in less than a year. The war, which had seemed on the verge of conclusion just months before, now appeared destined to grind on indefinitely. The rapid advances and retreats, the swelling ranks of refugees, and the devastation left in the army's wake told a story of a nation caught in the gears of great power rivalry. Throughout these campaigns, the international dimension of the war became increasingly pronounced. The United States provided the lion's share of troops and materiel, but dozens of other countries contributed forces, medical units, or logistical support under the United Nations command. The British, Australians, Canadians, Turks, and others fought alongside Americans and South Koreans in battles up and down the peninsula. The conflict was, in many ways, the first major test of the United Nations' capacity to mobilize collective security in the face of aggression, though in practice, the command structure and decision-making remained tightly controlled by the United States. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, played a more shadowy role, providing arms, advisors, and diplomatic support to the North, but stopping short of open military intervention. Soviet-supplied MiG fighter jets, flown by both North Korean and Soviet pilots, clashed with American planes in the skies above Korea, marking the first jet-to-jet dogfights in history. Yet the superpowers avoided direct conflict on the ground, wary of escalation that might draw the world into another global war. By the spring of 1951, the front lines stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, the very border that had divided the peninsula before the conflict began. The initial hopes of both sides, whether for quick victory or unification, had been dashed by the realities of war and intervention. The Korean War had become a ferocious stalemate, with both armies entrenched and the civilian population suffering immensely. The dramatic swings of the first year, the sudden invasion, the desperate defense, the audacious counterattack, and the shocking intervention of China had transformed the conflict into a grinding war of attrition. The opening chapters of the Korean War revealed the dangers of a divided world, where local disputes could ignite global confrontations and where the ambitions of leaders collided with the fates of ordinary people. The rapid advances and retreats, the intervention of international forces, and the shattering impact of war on the Korean people set the stage for a prolonged and bitter struggle, one that would shape not only the destiny of Korea, but the course of the Cold War itself. By the summer of 1951, the Korean War had settled into a grim deadlock. The dramatic campaigns and sweeping offenses of the previous year gave way to a new, punishing reality. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Along a jagged, battered front that snaked across the peninsula, soldiers from North Korea, China, South Korea, the United States, and other United Nations forces found themselves locked in a war of attrition. The battlefield, once marked by the rapid movement of armies, became a landscape of trenches, bunkers, and wire, an echo of the positional warfare that had scarred the fields of Europe a generation earlier. Life at the front was unrelenting. Soldiers huddled in muddy foxholes and hastily dug trenches, exposed to constant danger. Artillery duels became a daily ordeal, as both sides pounded the opposing lines in hopes of breaking the stalemate. Patrols crept out under cover of darkness, probing for weaknesses and sometimes clashing in fierce, close-quarters combat between the lines. Every gain was measured in yards, every advance paid for in blood. The casualties mounted steadily, with neither side able to tip the balance. It was a war of exhaustion, not movement, a contest of endurance and willpower. The scale of the fighting during these years of stalemate was staggering. Major battles erupted over key ridges and outposts, with names like Heartbreak Ridge and Porkchop Hill entering the lexicon of those who fought there. The lines themselves shifted little, but the cost of holding and contesting them was enormous. Each assault or counterattack was met with equally determined resistance. The dead and wounded accumulated, while the living endured. The inability of either side to break through the other's defenses meant that the war dragged on, seemingly without end. No less harrowing were the conditions endured by soldiers on both sides. The Korean landscape, with its steep hills and dense forests, offered scant protection against the elements. Winters were particularly cruel. As the cold descended, temperatures plummeted, and the wind cut through uniforms and blankets with merciless efficiency. Frostbite became a common affliction, sometimes robbing men of fingers and toes before help could arrive. The relentless cold seeped into bones, turning simple acts, digging a trench, handling a weapon, staying alert into feats of endurance. Even in quieter sectors, the threat of sudden shellfire or a probing patrol meant that rest was fitful and brief. Yet it was not only the soldiers who suffered. The ceaseless fighting and shifting front lines took a heavy toll on civilians. Villages caught between the armies were often destroyed or abandoned. Families were divided, homes lost, livelihoods ruined. For many, the war was a season of hunger, fear, and dislocation. The prospect of peace, so fervently hoped for, receded with every shell burst and every failed offensive. Against this bleak backdrop, the search for a negotiated settlement slowly gained urgency. By July 1951, both sides had come to recognize that victory, at least in the sense of driving the enemy from the peninsula, was out of reach. The cost of continuing the war, measured in human lives and political risk, was becoming too high. Thus, representatives began to gather at the negotiating table, hoping to hammer out terms for an armistice. But if the fighting along the front was bitter, the diplomatic struggle proved no less arduous. The armistice talks, which began in July 1951, would drag on for more than 2 years, a testament to the deep mistrust and conflicting priorities of the combatants. Negotiations unfolded at Kaesong and later at Panmunjom, with delegations from the United Nations Command, North Korea, and China facing each other across green baize tables. The issues at stake were complex and emotionally charged. Where would the final line of demarcation be drawn? What would become of prisoners of war, many of whom feared returning to their respective homelands? How could both sides ensure that neither would use a ceasefire as an opportunity to rearm and regroup? The talks were often excruciatingly slow. Delegates haggled over the shape and size of the negotiating table, the precise wording of each clause, and the smallest points of protocol. Progress was frequently stalled by outbreaks of renewed fighting, walkouts, and accusations of bad faith. The question of prisoner repatriation proved especially thorny. Many captured soldiers did not want to be sent back, and the treatment of prisoners became a flashpoint that threatened to derail the entire process. Observers grew weary, and the world watched with a mixture of hope and frustration as the months slipped by with little apparent movement toward peace. All the while, soldiers continued to fight and die on the frozen hills and scarred valleys of Korea. The military lines shifted only slightly. An outpost gained here, a ridge lost there, but the underlying reality changed little. The war had become a contest not just of armies but of negotiating teams, each seeking to secure the best possible terms without appearing to surrender or concede. Finally, after 2 years of wrangling, the outlines of an agreement began to take shape. Both sides accepted that a military ceasefire, rather than a formal peace treaty, was the most that could be achieved for the moment. On July 27, 1953, representatives of the United Nations Command, the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army signed the Korean Armistice Agreement. South Korea's President Syngman Rhee, fiercely opposed to any settlement that left Korea divided, refused to sign, but the military commanders pressed ahead, recognizing that the alternative was an indefinite continuation of bloodshed. The terms of the armistice were strictly military in nature. It called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the creation of a buffer zone, the now infamous Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, stretching approximately 4 kilometers wide along the final line of contact. This DMZ, heavily fortified and bristling with barbed wire, landmines, and guard posts, would serve as a physical and symbolic barrier between North and South Korea. The agreement also established a military armistice commission, tasked with supervising the ceasefire and resolving disputes. A neutral nations supervisory commission was created to monitor compliance, drawing personnel from countries not directly involved in the conflict. Prisoners of war were to be exchanged, though not all would return to their home countries. The issue of voluntary repatriation, a sticking point throughout the negotiations, was addressed by allowing prisoners who refused repatriation to choose a neutral destination. The armistice did not resolve the fundamental political questions at the heart of the conflict. There was no peace treaty, no recognition of legitimacy for either government, no formal end to the war. The guns fell silent, but the peninsula remained divided. In the weeks and months that followed, the battered armies withdrew from their forward positions, and the DMZ took shape as a no-man's land, desolate yet paradoxically alive with the constant vigilance of opposing forces. The armistice brought relief from active combat, but it was a fragile peace, maintained more by deterrence and exhaustion than by reconciliation. The legacy of the armistice has proven profound and enduring. The Korean peninsula remained and remains divided, two states gazing warily at each other across the most heavily fortified border in the world. The DMZ as a stark reminder of the unresolved conflict, a scar that cuts across mountains, rivers, and the collective memory of a people once united. Even decades later, the line remains tense, with periodic incidents and crises reminding the world that the war has never been formally concluded. The United States maintained a significant military presence in South Korea after the armistice, a commitment that has continued to the present day. This presence, intended as a guarantee against renewed aggression, has shaped the security landscape of Northeast Asia. The armistice did not bring reconciliation, but it did establish a framework that has, so far, prevented a return to all-out war. For the people of Korea, the end of active hostilities brought some respite, but the cost of the war lingered. Families divided by the demilitarized zone remained separated, cut off by politics and barbed wire. Towns and farmlands lay in ruins, the work of rebuilding hampered by the ongoing state of suspended hostilities. The psychological wounds, grief, anger, and the uncertainty of an unfinished war were slow to heal. On the broader world stage, the Korean armistice set precedents that would echo through later conflicts. The use of multinational forces under a United Nations banner, the challenge of negotiating ceasefires amid continuing violence, and the creation of demilitarized zones as temporary solutions, all became part of the diplomatic and military playbook in the Cold War era and beyond. The Korean War and its inconclusive ending became a case study in the limitations of military power and the complexities of peacemaking in a divided world. Scholars and analysts have continued to debate the lessons of the Korean armistice. Some point to the dangers of unresolved conflict and the risk that a mere cessation of fighting without addressing root causes can leave a region perpetually on edge. Others note the stability provided by the armistice, arguing that, imperfect as it is, the agreement has averted further catastrophe. The Korean peninsula remains a place where the past is never far away, where the hopes of peace and the fears of renewed war exist side by side. In the end, the stalemate and armistice of 1953 did not bring closure to the Korean War. The guns fell silent, but the issues at the war's heart, national identity, legitimacy, and the fate of a divided people remained unresolved. The scars of the conflict endure in the landscape, in the memories of those who lived through it, and in the tense vigilance of soldiers who still stand guard along the demilitarized zone. The war's legacy, its lessons, its unresolved tensions, its human costs continues to shape not only Korea but the wider world, a reminder that some wars do not so much end as pause, awaiting a peace that remains elusive, even after the shooting stops.